The road climbed in narrow switchbacks, a pale strip through a dark forest that had not been plowed in weeks. I idled the truck at each bend to listen for engine noise that was not mine and for the uneven scrape of undead feet on crusted snow. Nothing answered. A broken sign ahead read, Summit House Lodge, the kind of family resort that sold hot cocoa in season and group passes to school buses. The lot beyond the sign looked frozen in place, a grid of half-buried cars, a drift swallowing a shuttle bus to its mirrors, lift towers marching up a white ridge into gray cloud. I chose a spot near the delivery bay where I could back the truck tight to a concrete wall, nose pointed downhill for a fast exit. I killed the engine and let the silence settle. Snow flurries ticked against the windshield. I told myself to move. The light would not last. I counted to 5 and opened the door. The air hit sharp and clean, and the cold reached through my clothes in a steady bite that would not forgive mistakes. I loaded what I could carry, locked the steering wheel out of habit, and went for the door marked Staff Only. The number pad above the handle had no power. The metal was brittle. The pry bar worked on the latch with steady pressure and no show. The door gave with a flat sound and a small fountain of ice crystals. I slid inside and pushed the truck ramp across the threshold as a brace. The service corridor stretched past a stack of folded linens, a cracked floor mat, and a poster with instructions for kitchen hygiene. The lights were dead. I worked by a small headlamp with a piece of red gel taped across the lens. The air smelled closed up and stale. I cleared rooms with the patience that kept people alive. Door, pause, listen, foot forward, heel first, sweep with the light, check corners and under tables. I did not call out. If anyone had been here with a pulse, the truck would have brought him, and an answer shouted into empty halls traveled too far. The kitchen was first, then the dish pit and the walk-in cooler. The cooler held nothing but white frost and a stacked crate of frozen carrots that had turned into orange stones. The bar still wore a branded beer sign and rows of stemware with dust outlining each circle. The main lobby waited beyond double doors with a horizontal push bar. I crouched and peered through the gap. The lodge opened in a wide room with heavy beams, a big stone hearth, and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the slopes. A row of rental skis leaned near the fireplace, all bright paint and slogans from a winter that had ended fast. To the left, a staircase rose to a mezzanine of guest rooms. I heard nothing. I went straight for the ski patrol office. The patrol office door had a small window. I cupped a hand to the glass and scanned. A shelf of trauma kits, a coil of rescue rope, helmets hung by chin straps. No movement. I opened it. The office smelled of antiseptic and pine cleaner. I found splints, bandages, a roll of tape, a box of chemical light sticks, and a laminated map of the resort with runs and lift lines marked in blue, green, and black. 2 avalanche beacons sat in a charger that had stopped mid-blink. A battered handheld radio rested in a cradle with a label, Channel 3 Patrol, Channel 6 Ops. I pocketed it, not because I expected a team to answer, but because radios are magnets for luck. In a drawer, I found a flare gun with 3 cartridges, dry and sealed, and a small vacuum bag of emergency blankets that rustled under my fingers. I slid one into my pack and kept moving. The generator room was behind a locked steel door that did not want attention. I left it for later. A maintenance bay near the lift controls held snow shovels, a stack of salt bags, and 2 yellow fuel cans. I shook one. Something sloshed, not much. The other was heavy. I set them by the service door. I walked the perimeter and found exits, checked that locks caught, and tied chime lines with empty soda cans and a handful of nuts and bolts. I wanted noise at shin level if something tried to nose in. Wind at this elevation made a lot of false alarms, so I kept the lines short and low behind doors where the air did not swirl. Darkness reached the mountain with no sunset to speak of, just a slow dulling of the snow until the slope and the sky carried the same flat tone. I kept my headlamp hooded and used a red pen light to move through the lobby. I did not start a real fire. Chimneys draw attention. Smoke trails at twilight brought company to places that still looked alive. Instead, I set the smallest canister stove under a kettle and melted snow in batches, pouring warm water into 2 dented thermoses I had carried since the first month. Food would be easy after that. A box of spaghetti sat open on a shelf. A jar of sauce with a tight lid stood next to it. The kitchen had spice tins and cardboard tubs of salt. I cooked a handful, added the sauce cold and thin, and ate standing at the prep table with the burners off. The building creaked in the wind in a way that insisted on notice. Each sound had a real source: timbers shrinking, a door latch settling, ice slipping from a gutter. But the mind did not care about precision at the first hour. A person's head invents visitors when the world holds its breath. To make the room honest again, I started working. I dragged 2 heavy couches into the manager's office at the back and set up a sleeping area that did not look out over any big window. I blocked the office door with a rolling file cabinet and left a 6-inch gap. The walkie lay on the desk within reach. I kept the flare gun in the top drawer. I took the radio to the roof access point and climbed the last short ladder with care. The snow up top had drifted into soft mounds, but the wind had scoured most of the surface hard. The view of the slopes under starless cloud felt wide and cold in a way that did not invite long thought. The lifts stood still, chairs waiting over the runs at fixed intervals, cables frozen. In the lot, the shuttle bus lay at an angle no bus should keep. I went back down before the dark pulled more of my attention than it deserved. At the desk, I turned the handheld radio on and rolled the dial. Static lived on most channels. On 3, I heard a faint carrier that rose and fell, the tail of a repeater far off. On 6, there was nothing. I listened for 5 minutes without a voice. I went back to 3, said, "Summit House Lodge, Survey 93, open copy," and released the key. The hiss came back untouched. I powered it down to save the battery and tucked it into a mug to keep it standing upright where I could grab it in the dark. The first noise from outside came later, a slow scrape followed by a clatter that rolled along the steel of the service bay. I leaned to the peephole I had drilled with the tip of the pry bar and saw a shape shuffle past in the spill from the distant snow. The gait was wrong for a living person at that temperature, slow in a way that did not show caution, but something else. The figure moved into the lot in a steady path and turned its head toward the lift towers. Another stood beyond, stuck at the edge of a drift up to the waist, arms half raised, held in the snow by the night's work. The cold did not end the infection, but it slowed it enough to turn speed into persistence. Cold kept the noise down too. I watched until nothing changed, and then hung a cooking pot by a piece of cord inside the corridor to amplify any shake on my chime lines. I set the timer on my watch to roll every 90 minutes and closed my eyes on the couch with my boots on. I woke at 2 alarms and found nothing to answer, so I made tea from a bag that had sat in its wrapper since a hotel closed last year. The steam rose in a thin ribbon. The office clock was dead, but my watch kept time. Past midnight, the wind built into a steady push that carried small bits of ice and set a whistle in one of the vent caps. The whistle had a pitch that suggested a bad bearing from my father's garage days. The memory steadied me. Names for sounds give a person traction. I wrote a short note in the manager's ledger with lettered block print. 02/in by 1640, single occupant, avoid fire, kitchen stocked lightly, patrol office intact, fuel unknown. I added a small arrow and the words service exit in case someone less steady arrived later and needed a straight line through uncertainty. After the third alarm, I put on my jacket and moved through the building again. The rental shop still held rows of boots arranged by size, and a rack of poles leaned against a pegboard. I picked a pair that reached my rib cage when the handle touched the floor. Poles are simple levers in a narrow space. The lift control booth had a binder with laminated emergency procedures and a key hung on a chain. I left the key. No reason to wake a town with a cable rattle and a motor roar. In the dining area, I found a popcorn machine that smelled faintly sweet, even cold and off. I took the smell as a promise that no one had died in that room. A person does not forget the difference once he has learned it. I did not sit. I tried not to sit unless there was a reason. Rest becomes glue. When the fourth alarm sounded and still nothing had moved, I forced myself to close my eyes again. Morning came slow and pale. The sky lifted from iron gray to a color that meant the sun existed behind it. I boiled snow, ate leftover spaghetti, and forced water. Outside, the mountain took form. Tree line, lifting fog, a cornice along the ridge. The lot had a pattern of tracks from the night, shallow paths that led nowhere and stopped in drift bowls. I found the maintenance garage. 2 snowcats waited behind a roll-up door with a chain lock I could open. I checked the machines for keys. One had a key dangling on a ribbon stuck to the steering column with tape. A bright note on the dash read, "Block heater required." The gauges slept cold. I checked the fuel site. There was some. I left it and checked the truck I had passed by the lift. The hood opened. The battery posts wore frost crust. I did not want to drain anything. I closed it all again and looked for hand pumps and siphon hoses. A blue plastic tub under a workbench offered both. I chose a corner of the lobby where the wall rose in stone around the fireplace, dragged a table and made a small work area. I laid out what I needed: map, marker, radio, watch, lighter, headlamp, extra gloves, and a ski pass lanyard that I cut into cordage. I drew a route down the service road to the main highway, and from there to a ranger station symbol on the map legend. I wrote RS and a question mark. I added Alt Base Village with a line down to the bottom of the chairlift. It would be crowded down there if anyone had seen the smoke from earlier weeks, so I crossed it out. I wanted an empty station with a roof, a wood stove, and a roof antenna that still did something. I put on a patrol jacket I found hanging on a hook. The color made me stand out against the snow, but the shell fabric cut the wind and the hood cinched right. I left through the side door and followed the wall to the edge of the building, crouched, and looked into the lot. The 2 figures I had seen at night had not improved. One still turned slowly in frozen slush with its hands at mid-chest. The other had sunk deeper until the snow held it to the belly. I skirted them and reached the snowcat garage. Inside, the smell of diesel and rubber sat thick and honest. I opened a tool chest and found a portable jump pack with a charge indicator that still read in the green. Next to it, a small inverter generator sat quiet, with a tag that said, "Fuel stabilized 10/." I shook it. Enough. I left both where they were for now. Noise decisions required daylight and eyes on the lot. Back in the kitchen, I took stock. Event menus from the last winter sat in a binder. Dry goods had been opened and sealed. I found rice sealed in a tub salt, sugar, a bag of coffee beans, and jars of pickles that had not blown their seals. The coffee grinder was manual. I turned the handle with slow, steady circles and made enough for a small press. The smell settled my head without tricks. I drank 2 cups and left a third in a thermos with the lid tight. I washed dishes in warm water to keep the place honest, not because anyone cared about a clean counter during a collapse, but because order gave the mind less to invent. At midday, I took the radio to the second-floor balcony that looked over the lobby and tried again. Summit House Lodge, open copy eastbound traffic. Nothing. I tried the weather station frequencies, found a recorded loop warning of blowing snow and wind chill, as if a family in a minivan were still choosing a scenic route. On a random scan, I caught a voice in bursts, not much more than a shape of words. Mile marker, meet, noon, repeat. The repeater was far. The direction did not ride in the static in any way I could trust. I gave it 5 minutes and the loop repeated with the same gaps. I added radio traffic faint at midday to my notes. Footprints crossed the beginner slope near the base of the magic carpet lift. I spotted them from the mezzanine through a streaked window. The prints were uneven and moved from the lower parking lot toward a set of small cabins along a tree line. The stride length said an adult, but the drag marks on the right were wrong. I went down with poles and a small pack and clipped a whistle to my jacket. I did not sound it. I followed the prints for 30 yards and felt the slope under my boots lose the crust and give in a way that warned of a hidden pocket. Snow pulls a person under in wells near trunks and grind lines. I did not go further. Distance is respect. I returned to the building with a slow scan of my surroundings and took a longer way back along a service path cut between snow fences. In the late afternoon, I decided the lodge could have a small fire for an hour to dry gear. I kept it brief and low. I cleaned the ash grate, stacked 3 split logs I found in a housekeeping closet beside a plastic tree stand, and used a twist of paper and a small square of fire starter from the patrol office. The smoke drew up well. I watched the chimney cap outside through the glass and stood ready with a lid for the fire if the wind pushed smoke sideways and made a signal. The flames took. The heat reached only the nearest rug, and the room's smell shifted from stale to wood in a way that felt safe. I hung gloves and socks on a chair back and set a metal kettle at the edge of the grate. When the water warmed, I filled my thermoses again and killed the flames by separating the pieces and pressing a metal tray over them. I rolled the coals into ash and spread it thin. The hearth went dark. I had just finished when a figure walked into the edge of the lot from the tree line opposite the delivery bay. The person wore a bright ski coat and carried a stick, but moved with a focus I recognized. The steps were deliberate. The head turned, not in the slow half-circle of something lost, but in quick angles, checking corners. I froze in the shadow of the wine rack and watched. The figure put a hand to the glass and then stepped back to show an open mouth and empty palms. A voice carried through the window, muffled by the double panes. "Hello? Anyone?" The voice belonged to a woman. I used a thumb to point from my chest to the service door and gestured down with my palm, then vanished from the window. I took a minute and came down the corridor and cracked the service door. The woman stood where I could see her full length. Her jacket was blue, her face red from the wind, and her hair stuck out from a beanie in clumps. I told her to roll up her sleeves. She did. I asked her to turn once. She did. I asked her to stay still for 5 minutes. She waited while the wind tugged her hood string. When the time was done, I opened the door and kept the pry bar in my hand with the end low. She said her name was Mara. She said she had hiked from a backcountry cabin with a friend 2 days ago, but a group of infected found the door and the friend ran for it before dawn. She said the friend did not make it down the slope. She did not over-explain. Her hands shook a little when she pulled off her gloves, not from drama but from the simple demands of cold. I brought her to the kitchen, gave her a thermos with warm water, and set a bowl of rice and beans that I had warmed on the stove. She ate without talking. I watched the windows. When she finished, she stood up, rinsed her bowl, and looked me in the eye and asked where I wanted her to stand watch. That answer told me more than any story. I gave her the mezzanine level for the next hour and the radio with instructions for channels 3 and 6. I told her to keep her head below the angled window line where the tint started. She nodded and went. With 2 people, the lodge felt larger and easier to hold. We agreed not to run the main generator. We used the small inverter to charge the radio and the jump pack for 20 minutes with the door propped and a cross flow of air, then packed it away. I showed her the chime lines, and she fixed one that had come loose in the wind with a square knot that did not slip. She asked to see the patrol office and took a small medkit to her pocket. We spoke in short sentences and checked our statements with our eyes. Words were not the main currency here. Work was. Night fell again, and the wind came back with more speed. Somewhere in the building, a downspout broke free and banged in the gusts. The sound had a pattern and then lost it. I went out to secure it with a strap while Mara watched the lot. I kept a line on my wrist tied to the door handle so a gust could not slam me shut. I used 2 screws from my pocket and the strap from a broken binding to fix the pipe enough to stop the movement. Back inside, we heard the scrape of an object on the carpet in the dining room. We moved together, low and slow, to the edge of the door. My penlight threw a dim red on a chair that had shifted 1/2 inch on a slant in the floor, where the boards had swelled. We stood there and let the empty room calm down the story that had sprung. Then we kept walking. Sometime around 1 in the morning, the chime line at the far end of the service corridor rattled quick, not the long, lazy ring of wind, but a rapid pattern with breaks. We had rehearsed without saying the word. She stayed high with the radio. I went low with a pole in each hand and the pry bar tucked behind my belt. I kept to the wall, let my eyes adjust, and listened for the second sound, breath or drag or a shoe on grit. I heard a small knock against the exterior door again, and then a third. The peephole showed a shadow and the edge of a sleeve. The person outside pressed his ear to the gap and made that soft animal noise the infected make when the throat is empty of purpose. I do not have a better name for it. Another set of steps approached from the lot, slower. Snow and noise had called them, or the smell of heat from the brief fire earlier remained in the seams. I did not open the door. I took the radio and spoke softly. 2 at service, 2nd incoming. And I heard Mara's small answer at once. Copy. We used a trick that had worked in other places. I took a portable radio from the patrol office, set it low, and placed it 50 yards away in the lift house and dialed it to a sports station that still looped game recaps from last winter. I set the volume to a gentle murmur, loud enough for a person near the door to catch a thread, quiet enough to keep it from ringing across the lot. Then I banged once on the inside of the service door with the pry bar and stepped back. The figure outside gave a small answer, turned, and drifted toward the faint voice in the lift house. The second shape followed the first. I waited until both bodies were past the angle of the wall, then slipped out and circled wide in the truck ruts from yesterday. I came around behind them and stepped to the lift house door, pushed it open, and swung the padlock hanging on its loop into place. The two had already pushed inside at the sound of the radio. I shut the door and clicked the lock, then slid a long bar through a U-bracket a foot from the ground and threaded a carabiner. The noise from the little radio inside kept going. The shapes in the small windows turned and bumped the glass once. The wind started to fill their sounds with its own voice. I went back inside the lodge and exhaled into my scarf until the sting faded. We stayed up until 3, not because of a rule, but because sleep would not serve if we took it in the first hour after a scare. We ate crackers and tinned peaches and watched each other's faces for the small signs that the corner had been turned. When I saw her eyes do slow blinks that stayed closed a fraction longer than normal, I sent her to the mezzanine couch and took the first watch from the lobby. I used the radio in a rhythm. Listen for 10 minutes, scan angles, sweep with the light, drink water, repeat. An hour later, I switched to my own couch. The office door stayed open 6 inches. The hallway light was off. The word safe did not belong here, but the room had no tricks left. Rest was justified. In the pale first light, I wrote another entry in the manager's ledger. 02/2 occupants, trapped 2 in lift house, note in lobby for future. I made a sign from a piece of the event board. Staff inside, do not break glass, use service door. I taped it at eye level. Glass was a liability. People had a habit of testing it when panic walked ahead of thought. I left a second note taped to the staircase. If you are reading this, you are not alone in the building. Call out once quietly and wait. It made me feel better to think of someone stepping into a room and finding a sentence that steered him a little. We planned for movement. The lodge had given what it could. More nights in one place drew attention the way a slow leak draws ants. We packed 2 sleds from the rental shop with the kind of things a winter place had in surplus. Ski pants, insulated gloves, goggles that were not scratched too badly, and a length of rope cut from the patrol coil. I added a pot with a lid, a small frying pan, a jar of peanut butter, and 3 bags of rice portioned into sealed bags. I took a few heavy trash bags and a roll of duct tape because everything breaks eventually. An improvisation like simple materials. Mara found a small handheld GPS in the patrol desk and said the batteries still had 2 bars. We checked the satellite page and saw a small cluster with weak signals, but enough to give a rough breadcrumb line. We turned it off to save power and agreed on a rule: no unnecessary navigation checks. We would read the terrain and use the map first. Check the unit only when the map failed to match the world in front of us. Before we left, we decided to sweep the guest rooms above the lobby to be sure no one slept alone behind one of those doors. We moved together. Each room had its variation of the same story. A bed with a comforter pulled back and sheets twisted. A window cracked for air before the power went out. A travel bag with socks and a half data cable. In one room, a set of footprints crossed the rug from the closet to the door, and then stopped at the threshold. A smear of mud touched the wall. We stepped back without touching anything. The room already had a conclusion and did not need 2 more editors. We closed the door and marked it with a small piece of tape shaped into an X so we would not open it again by accident. We took a last look at the slope from the mezzanine. The day had cleared a little. A cold blue had worked into the sky where the gray had been. The lift house we had used as a trap sat quiet. I pictured the radio running its last bit of battery and dropping to silence. The 2 inside would push and claw until the cold slowed everything except the small animal circuits that never shut off. I did not like trapping anything, even things that had walked out of the normal rules of life. But the math was the math. We needed the time and the quiet. It was better than hands-on work that would leave marks in the mind. We turned away. We left the lodge by the service road. The snow did not rise past our knees on the packed center, and the edges held soft drifts that a boot could disappear into. The rope tied between our belts held a loose line. We moved in silence unless there was a reason to speak. When we did, it was the language of terrain. Edge, slab, well, ice. At a switchback, the road passed under a chair span. A chair hung less than a yard over the road where drift had lifted the ground. A scarf twisted around the seat bar. I did not touch it. Items left behind were stories we did not need to read. 2/3 of the way down, we heard a steady, soft knock from the right. The sound repeated and paused. I stuck the pole into the snow and felt a hollow space that ran along the base of the trees, a well that formed where branches had held new snow up and then settled. The knock came again. I lay flat and pulled my goggles to the top of my hat and peered into the void. A hand moved in slow, small jerks, pressing with the palm against packed snow from below. Fingers were bare and pale. A sleeve showed a lift ticket clipped to a zipper pull. The person under the snow had found a pocket and had pressed upward as the space closed. The air exchange could not be good. I told Mara to stand back and take weight off the area. I cut a slot into the side of the drift with the shovel I had strapped to my sled, making an angled trench rather than a hole straight down. I scraped with the shovel edge, careful not to collapse the roof of the pocket. Until I knew where the face was, the hand twitched. I saw a sleeve, then a shoulder, then a face, all white with a faint gray around the lips. The eyes tracked slowly and fixed on me. The mouth opened but made no sound. I asked a simple question. "Bites?" The head moved the smallest amount, and then stopped. I pulled a space open enough for air, slid the rescue blanket in to reflect a little heat, and kept the trench low and long. We worked in steady, patient pulls, moving snow downwind so it would not drift back. We reached the ribs and then the waist. The person's jacket had a line of small holes near the wrist where an animal had tested a bite but not committed. The skin showed no broken line. The person had been trapped less than a day. I did not want to measure inexactly. I pulled the body up with the rope under the armpits while Mara backed up the slope. We got him out and rolled him into the shallow trench to reduce wind exposure. His lips were cracked. He made a small chuff that might have been a word. He was in his late 40s, with a gray beard and a bib ski pant. His name was clipped to the jacket on a rental tag. Sean. He said water in a voice made of sand. I poured a little onto his tongue and then a little more. His hands shook hard enough to spill most of it. He tried to sit up and failed. We wrapped him in the emergency blanket and gave him a foil hat from the med kit to keep heat from leaving fast. He shivered against the metal film and gritted his teeth. The cold can hurt a body on the way back to normal, so we kept the heat small and steady with a chemical warmer pack wrapped in a sock placed at his chest. We did not give more heat than that. He looked at me and then at the rope and then at the road. He pointed downhill with a small motion. That was the plan. I nodded and clipped the blanket to the sled with the tarp straps. Mara took the lead on the rope, and I took the handle on the back of the sled and kept the run straight on the packed center. We moved. At the bottom, near the resort's base village, the road leveled and the wind settled. We could see a cluster of buildings with glass fronts and pastel logos half covered in snow. A rental shop window had been broken recently, and a cash drawer lay open and empty on the floor. We did not stop. The village felt like a stage with room for too many actors. We kept to the service lane behind the buildings and crossed a small bridge over a creek, with enough moving water to stay open where most streams had frozen. At the far edge of the village, a small ranger station sat under firs, simple brown boards, and a small porch with 2 steps. A sign on the porch rail read, "Search and Rescue." We took the steps slow and tried the door. It opened with weight. Inside, the air was cold but not sharp. A wood stove waited in the corner, an iron box with a glass window. The walls held maps and a shelf of binders. The radio corner had a small base unit with a microphone and a pack of batteries on a string. A simple Mercy sat on the desk, a stack of split wood and a box of matches in a jar. I checked the chimney cap through the side window and saw no snow blocking the pipe. I crumpled a page from an old incident report, lit it, and held it near the stove flue to test the draw. The flame pulled toward the pipe. I fed small wood first, and then 2 larger pieces. The glass clouded and then cleared. I closed the stove door and set Sean on a pad that had been left near the wall. Mara took his hands and rubbed them through the blanket to move blood without stress. I went to the radio and turned it on. A red light came up slow. I checked the channel card taped to the desk. I keyed the mic and spoke for 10 slow seconds. Station 1. 2 adults and 1 rescue. Request status. Request time check. We waited. When the response came, it was thin but clean. A man's voice speaking a name and an agency, and then asking ours. I gave first names. I said we were not sick. I said we had one with exposure and no bites. The voice gave a time and a plan. If you can stay, stay. If you can move, move at 9 to mile marker 22. I will meet at the pull-off if it is clear. Repeat schedule. I wrote it down and read it back. The man said copy, and the static filled the gap a moment later. We needed to hold the station for the night. The map on the wall showed the pull-off he had named, a small widening in the road with a view of a lake. It was 2 miles from the village. Getting there in the dark with a half-frozen man and unknown visitors was foolish. We locked the windows, set a line on the door with the same soda can trick, and stacked 1 metal file cabinet in front of the back exit because the hinge screws had pulled loose in the last storm. I fed the stove again in small amounts. The room's temperature rose slowly. Sean's face turned from gray to a kind of chalk with less blue in it. He spoke a sentence that told a story through gaps. He had been on a weekly climb with a small group that had scattered when the last push went wrong. He had stayed with one person as long as he could, and then had slid into the well and waited. He did not add adjectives. I did not ask for any. We ate in shifts. Mara chewed a protein bar with small bites and washed it down with hot water. I heated a small can of chicken soup we had found on a shelf and split it between a mug and a bowl. The meat was soft and had no smell to wake memories I did not want. Sean sipped from the mug and then rested. His eyes closed in short stretches and then opened and focused. I checked his hands for frost damage. The skin was pale and stiff, but not deadened in a way that meant loss. We wrapped his hands loosely and set them above his chest under the blanket. We made a plan in 5 lines, rotate watch, small fire, radio check at the top of each hour, leave at first light if no radio traffic said otherwise. Night at the station felt different than the lodge. The room was small, the stove gave a steady glow, and the porch light glass cut the wind's rattle. The smaller space made sound honest. At one point, a branch dropped snow onto the porch roof in a soft slide, and the noise was exactly what it was. I sat by the radio and rolled the headset in my fingers in a slow rhythm that kept me present. Mara wrote in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. Not in a dramatic way, but in tight block letters meant for later. I respected that. People who write in situations like this are not always writing for now. Sometimes they are writing for a version of themselves who wakes on a better morning and needs to know that impatience did not run the show. An hour past midnight, the radio hiss shifted, and a voice I did not know slid in. It spoke fast in bursts, the tale of a vehicle radio near the range edge. Bridge, south, collapsed. Repeat, bridge south collapsed. Turn. The antenna printed the words as a thin whisper. The message did not concern our route, but it told me the world still had moving parts. That meant moving minds and moving problems. Mara looked up from the notebook and met my eyes. We both checked the map for bridges and traced likely detours with fingertips. Then we returned to our seats and the small stove glow. I slept for 2 hours on the floor mat beside the wall while Mara took the radio. When I woke, the fire had been fed twice and the room held a gentle warmth that did not cloud judgment. Sean snored in short, steady bursts that made a kind of metronome. His color had improved. I slid a small piece of wood into the stove and cracked the door to watch flames for 1 minute. I closed it and checked the time. 5 hours remained until first light. At dawn, the clouds parted enough to show a thin band of red low on the horizon. The color was crisp and short-lived. I fed the stove once more and then let it burn down. We packed light, radio, flare gun, 2 emergency blankets, the ropes, and a bag of rice with a tin cup for water. We left the sleds, too heavy for the short stretch ahead, but kept the blanket under Sean and tied the corners to make a sling. He stood with help and took slow, careful steps with a ski pole in each hand. We moved in a short file with Mara in front, me behind with one hand on the blanket to take some of the weight. The road was clear enough where drifts had been cut by old plows. We reached the mile marker in 20 minutes and then stepped into the pull-off. The lake below lay under a skin of ice with a small open patch near the dam. The pull-off had a picnic table buried to the seats and a signboard under a mask of frost. The empty highway looked long and straight. For a moment, the world felt almost normal in shape, even if all the small sounds of traffic and the hum of wires were gone. The plan was to wait until 9. I checked my watch, checked the tree line, checked the road in both directions. At 8:50, a sound came from the south, thin at first and then clear, an engine, steady and slow. We stepped back from the road edge behind the trunk of a pine, and I had the flare gun in my jacket pocket, safety strap off. The vehicle appeared around the bend, a Department of Transportation pickup with a plow frame on the front, but no blade. Amber light bar off, cab intact. The driver wore a thick jacket and gloves and had the radio mic in his hand even while driving. He pulled to a stop 10 yards short and put a hand out the window in a universal signal. Palms open, show me your empty hands. I raised mine. Mara raised hers. Sean lifted his once and then dropped them back to his blanket to keep the heat in. The driver stepped out slowly, closed his door with a soft push instead of a slam, and looked at our faces. He kept his right hand visible and his left hand near the radio mic, not a weapon. He said his name and his department, and said he had been told to check mile marker 22 for 2 travelers with 1 injured. He did not ask to see our teeth. He did not ask us to recite an oath. He asked to see our hands again, and then our wrists. We showed him. He asked where we had come from. I pointed up. He nodded, looked at the ridge, and let out a small breath that made a white cloud. He looked relieved, yes, but in a way that sat in his shoulders as a thin slackening rather than a theatrical gesture. I liked him for that. He had a blanket in the cab and a thermos with coffee that he offered without asking. Sean took it with both hands and drank in small sips. The driver said the bridge south had indeed collapsed, and that he had to head north to a maintenance yard that held fuel and a working repeater. He said the yard had walls. The walls did not promise perfection. The walls promised a fence, a roof, and shared work. That was enough. He said we could follow if we kept to the right of his tail. He could not carry all of us in a single trip without shifting cargo that mattered to him, but he could escort. We agreed without drama. We loaded Sean into the cab with the driver and folded him into the blanket like a child for a short time without making him feel small. Mara and I walked behind the truck at 20 yards, far enough not to eat exhaust, close enough to use the path the tires cut through the drifted lane. The truck moved slow. At each turn, the driver checked his mirror, lifted a hand to signal, and waited for our nod. The radio in his cab kept up a murmur of codes and road names. Names anchor a person. Road names are good names to hear. We reached the yard after 30 minutes. It sat behind a high chain-link fence with slats. A small blue light flickered over the entrance. The gate was closed but not locked, secured with a chain that someone could unloop rather than cut. The driver got out, opened it, and waved us in. He closed it behind us and slid the chain back in place. The yard held a low building with a corrugated roof, a row of snowblowers under tarps, and a fuel tank with a manual pump. The building's door had 3 locks, all turned, and a 4th lock bypassed with a bolt from a hardware store. The driver undid his locks and looked back at us once. We waited until he cleared his own space before we crossed the threshold. He had a right to protect his little bit of order. Inside, the air was warmer than the station had been. A kerosene heater hissed softly in the corner. A map with pins covered one wall. A whiteboard listed names and dates. On the table sat a stack of ration bars, a box of bottled water, and a box of gloves. The driver offered us seats and said he had 2 rules. No arguments about old things, and share the cleaning. I said those rules overlapped enough to be one rule. He smiled. It was a small human moment that did not try to wear anything bigger than itself. Mara took off her hat and ran her hands through her hair, and then laughed once, short and contained, at the heater's hiss. Sean leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He was not out of danger, but he was away from the snow pocket and the slow crush of space. I wrote another entry in my notebook, small and clear. Summit House Lodge, safe for short stays with caution, patrol office stocked, snowcat garage holds 1 working jump pack, 2 cats untested, small inverter generator in maintenance bay, trapped 2 in lift house by radio lure, fuel, limited but present, kitchen, rice, pasta, spices, pickles, notes left on site. 2-person team plus 1 rescue reached DOT Yard North at 10:35. I closed the book and put it in my jacket pocket. That record would help the next version of me and anyone else whose path crossed that mountain. We spent the day earning the roof. We shoveled out the gate track, cleared a path to the fuel tank, and checked the fence line for gaps. We took turns on radio watch. We cleaned the corner where old coffee had glued paper to a counter. We did small things that say to the mind, this is held now, at least for a while. The driver showed me the repeater cabinet in a back room. The meters worked. The battery bank had enough charge. He said the yard sometimes caught calls from far out, and sometimes it did not. Weather and terrain were in charge of that. He pointed to a stack of old traffic cones and asked if I wanted to turn them into wind chimes to scare off raccoons. I said I had a better trick with soda cans and bolts. He said to show him. I did. He nodded and said that was smarter and cheaper. He wrote can chimes on the whiteboard and underlined it once. That night, After we had eaten and the heater had worked its way into the walls, I stepped outside onto the small covered stoop. The wind had calmed. The night had a clean, sharp smell. The yard lights lit a narrow world. The ridge where the lodge sat stood as a darker line against the sky. The chair towers up there would still hold their silent weight. The lift house would hold two quiet shapes. The notes in the manager's ledger would sit on the desk, and the map with the route marked would be there for whoever came next. The lodge was not home. It had been a station on a road with too many broken names, but it had held us for a night and a day and had not tried to keep us. That counted for something. I went back inside and closed the door behind me without noise. Mara slept on a cot near the heater, one hand over her notebook. Sean breathed in slow, steady lines. The driver scratched a note on the board and put the marker in the tray like a man who had made a habit of neat endings. I lay down on a canvas cot and listened to the heater and the small clicks of a building settling after a day of wind. The room did not make promises, but it did not ask for any either. I slept because work was waiting in the morning, and because resting meant the next hour would be better than the last. That was the only bargain left that made sense. Morning arrived clear. The driver outlined a run to two nearby cabins to check for stranded skiers and a detour to a supply cache he had seeded last month. We volunteered to go with him. He said yes. He had watched us working and decided we were not going to drain his roof without paying for our space. The day felt like a page with a pencil line ready. I took one last look at the ridge and then focused on the road ahead. The lodge would sit and wait for someone else. The mountain would keep its cold rules. Our job was simple. Stay moving when movement mattered, make stillness honest when it was needed, and leave good signs for the next person in line. I adjusted the strap on my pack, tightened my boots, and nodded to the driver. He nodded back. We opened the door and stepped into the day.